You're listening to Beat Autoimmune and Thrive, the podcast all about reversing and preventing autoimmune conditions so you can live your most vibrant life as soon as possible. We talk about autoimmune root causes, actionable solutions, and inspirational healing stories. I'm Palmer Kippola, and I used to have MS. Today, I'm an author, a speaker, a functional medicine certified health coach, a pickleball player, and nature lover who's helped thousands of people reclaim their health and their best lives. Let's dive into this episode. Welcome back. I am delighted to be rejoined by my guest, Scott Forsgren. He is a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, and he is the founder and owner of the BetterHealthGuy Blogcast, my favorite podcast, I have to be honest, where he brings on the tippy top practitioners in functional and integrative health. Welcome back, Scott. I'm delighted to have you back. And I just want to say to people, if you haven't dug into part one, you want to start with that because we're going to pick up where we left off. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you so much, Palmer. It's an honor to be here.
I love it. I love it. So, as I recall, we are on step 6 of your holistic healing framework, which is all about stabilizing mast cells, reducing inflammation, and modulating the immune response. Talk to us about why this is so important.
Yeah, so I think there's a perception that the microbe is what we need to address and essentially killing bugs and this kind of kill mentality. And that used to be my approach as well. But what I've learned over the years is that the bug does not make the disease, that what makes the disease is the host's response to the bug. So if the immune system is hyperactive, overactive, if it's responding in an autoimmune leaning fashion, that's what's creating a lot of our symptoms and creating what we experience or identify as dis-ease. And so that inflammation, a lot of that in these conditions is driven by mast cell activation syndrome, by histamine intolerance, a number of triggers for mast cell activation, similar to limbic system. It's not just one thing. So mast cells can be triggered by mold exposure, parasites, Lyme disease, environmental toxicants, medications, food that we eat, supplements even in some cases, changes in temperature, physical or emotional stress, EMFs. There's so many things that can trigger the mast cells to release histamine and other mediators that increase our level of inflammation. And I think that eventually we will come to a consensus that electromagnetic fields are a major trigger of mast cells and a major trigger of inflammation. Dr. Theo Herides, who is an expert on mast cells and has studied them for over 3 decades, he said at a conference last year that mast cells are 10 times more activated in the presence of a cell phone. And even knowing what I knew, that statement kind of blew me away. 10 times more activated in the presence of a cell phone. So that's another reason why, that comes early on, minimizing our exposures to then minimize the mast cell activation, to minimize inflammation. Ideally, people would at least do a trial of a low histamine diet. I think there's a great list that was created by Dr. Raj Patel and Dr. Talia Hale. That's available on their website at medicaloptionsforwellness.net. Fantastic list that they've tweaked based on their clinical experience over the last several years. And so people are often surprised that the things that we thought were healthy can be problems for people with mast cell issues. So kombucha, avocados, bone broth, fermented foods. We think of those as health promoting, but very commonly in people that have mast cell activation with these chronic conditions, it actually makes the problem worse. We can implement various mast cell stabilizers and histamine reducers, things like quercetin or luteolin. Holy basil is another great tool. There's a few products. Dr. Theo Herides has a product that he formulated called NeuroProtect that is fantastic. Ben Lynch has a product through Seeking Health called Probiota Histamine X, which I love. Dr. Chris Shade has created Hista Aid with Quicksilver. So these can all be great tools. There's also things like ketotifen, chromalin, Forsgren, DAO or diamine oxidase, and a number of other things that can help really stabilize the mast cells and reduce histamine. And so once we treat that mast cell activation piece, that oftentimes leads to very significant shifts in how people feel. So you're simultaneously working to really remove or minimize the underlying triggers that are driving the mast cell activation so that you have this longer term improvement and or resolution of that condition. And then beyond the mast cell activation piece, there's the immune modulation side of this whole thing. So if the immune system is overreacting, what are some other things we can do to modulate or calm it? Low-dose naltrexone is very common in this environment and with autoimmune conditions, for example. Low-dose immunotherapy with Dr. Ty Vincent has been a phenomenal tool for many people. Peptides like thymosin alpha, thymosin beta 4, those can be great. Homeopathy plays a role here. A number of different tools that can really kind of help to balance the immune system, modulate this Th1, Th2 response. It's not always about boosting the immune system, which I think is a common misconception that if there's an autoimmune condition, boosting the immune system can actually make that condition worse. That it's really about modulating, it's about calming, it's about integrating with our microbes in a way that is synergistic and health supporting.
Beautiful. That's really, really important. And as I'm hearing you talk about these mast cells, it sounds like you're both addressing the root cause that is causing the mast cell activation. And at the same time, you're bringing down the level of inflammation and that mast cell activation with those supplements in a supportive way. So you're really addressing it both from a bottoms up and a top down perspective. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple different perspectives with mast cell activation. I think some practitioners look at it that the core illness is the mast cell activation. I think other people look at it that is the result of a trigger like EMFs or mold or parasites and so on. I'm in that latter camp where I do believe that it is a resolvable piece of our journey, that we don't have to continue to have mast cell activation syndrome. And so we don't just want to suppress the mast cells and reduce histamine. We want to get at the real triggers, or essentially the nails in the foot, so to speak, that are causing the immune system to have that response.
Perfect. Thank you. Your step 7 is about optimizing hydration, nutrition, the microbiome, and gut health, which is interesting that you put it so far into your process. Can you talk about why it's there and what tools do you find helpful in this regard?
Yeah. So again, any of these steps can potentially be moved up or down. I just think that some of the pieces are so critical: the detox, the environmental piece, starting to work on the mental, emotional, the limbic system, and so on. So hydration, I think, is difficult. That many of us drink gallons of water, pee it out, and are still cellularly dehydrated. So structuring water, adding some electrolytes, adding some trace minerals, maybe a pinch of sea salt. Those can be a good start to help support the hydration. Structuring the water, there's things like natural action water system. There's a device called the Somavedic that's used to help harmonize the environment from an EMF perspective, but you can also use it to structure water, which is an interesting tool. Shungite Stone, that's also something that can help structure the water. There's a tool called the Balancing by Numbers disc that you can set your water on, that has different frequencies and codes essentially in that device that then are imparted into the water. There's also a number of homeopathic tools like rehydration from energetics, for example, that can really help to support getting hydrated from the water that we're consuming. And then there's a number of tools out there like Wattah, Wattah, I believe. That's a product that you can purchase, and I like it. The challenge is when you start shipping large amounts of water, the cost for shipping is really going to be as much as the water itself. So I think using some of these tools where we can improve the quality of our water is really ideal. And then so much of our immune system comes from the gut. If we have leaky gut, we're triggering that immune dysregulation. We're triggering the mast cells like we just talked about. Mold plays a very significant role in creating leaky gut, in triggering the mast cells. So we really need to remove our triggering foods. I think in this realm of complex conditions, autoimmune conditions, neurodegenerative conditions, gluten is bad for almost everyone. I know some people will try to justify that it's okay for them. It's probably not. Dairy is bad for some people. Sugar, probably bad for most. The high histamine foods that we talked about, also bad for many. And it really needs to be individualized, but we need to be sure that we're not continuing to trigger inflammation and assuming that we're going to be able to get well. So there's so many different diets that are out there. It's going to be very individualized. People have heard of paleo or autoimmune paleo or ketogenic or GAPS or SCD or FODMAPs and so on. The one that I've seen make the biggest difference is probably low histamine. So I think that one is worth a trial. And then the things that we are eating should be highly nutrient dense, living foods. So healthy fats and healthy proteins. I love my Power Shake every morning. So high quality protein, some collagen occasionally, a fiber blend, phospholipids like phosphatidylcholine and others, healthy fats, chia seeds, organic nut milk. For me, that's a great way to start the day. And then supporting our microbiome. So I love Megaspore Biotic. It's a spore-based probiotic. It's generally well tolerated, even in people with mast cell activation or SIBO. It's providing those foundational or keystone strains to optimize our microbial diversity. And it can help with inflammation and immune modulation as well, helpful for leaky gut. So that's one that I personally take every day. And things like Megaspore Biotic or BPC 157, those can be great tools to really optimize that lining of the gastrointestinal tract and reducing that intestinal hyperpermeability. There's also a great product from Dr. Zach Bush. It's commonly called Restore. It's been renamed to Ion Gut Health, but that's a fantastic tool as well.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful gems. Speaking of gems, there's one question I have. You mentioned something called Shungite Stone. I don't know if I'm saying that right, to structure our water. Is that something, you have to spell it for us, but is that something we actually place in water?
Yeah, so Shungite is Shungite. And I've seen it done both ways. I've seen some companies that will provide the stones and tell you to put them in the water. Mm-hmm. I've also seen some practitioners that suggested in their really sensitive patients that was a bit too much. And they have them start out by putting water in a glass jar and then putting a rubber band around the outside of the glass and having the stones then be outside the glass. And they find that is oftentimes a good way to introduce this concept, but they can also be put into the water as well.
I love it. Thank you for clarifying that one. That's perfect. All right. Step 8. This is about adding supportive interventions like mitochondrial support, KPU, coagulation, and adrenals. Tell us more about these.
Yeah, so these are also big areas. One of the areas that I've become more interested in the past couple of years is the mitochondria. We really need that cellular energy to support the body in detoxifying, in its function, in its repair. Red light therapy is one of the tools that I like for supporting the mitochondria. There's a number of tools on the market to do that. I'm sure people have heard of things like CoQ10. NAD is something that's getting more discussion in the community over the last year or two. One of the challenges with mitochondrial support is that ATP is the danger signal in the cell danger response model. So if people are familiar with Dr. Robert Naviau's work from UC San Diego, we have to do this at the right time. If the body is intentionally down-regulating systems as a protective mechanism from some type of threat, then trying to stimulate mitochondria may not work at that point in time. So again, this could move earlier or later, depending on where people are. You kind of have to get the body out of that stuck mode before you really aggressively support the mitochondria. One of the areas that Dr. Klinghardt has talked about for many years, in fact, he and I have written 2 articles on this topic, is cryptopyrroluria, or KPU. And so essentially that's in the Lyme disease and other chronic illness realm, that's a condition where people tend to pee out zinc and B vitamins that are needed to support the immune system. So the white blood cells essentially are like an army with no bullets, that these deficiencies really then are not providing us the immune defenses that we need. So supporting those things can help to support the immune system. You do have to do it slowly. You can go too fast. You can create more inflammation. You can trigger a release of heavy metals. I think it's important to recognize that it's always a marathon and not a sprint in this kind of a condition. So those articles are available. People can find that on my website, and it goes into much, much more detail.
Yes. And I've shared that on my website as well. I hope you don't mind, because it is such valuable information.
Beautiful.
I think that people need to know about it. And frankly, the Townsend newsletter, am I saying it right?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic scientific journal. And congratulations for having 2 articles in there. That says so much.
Yeah, thank you.
About you.
Another area that I think is important is exploring coagulation. And this is one that I personally have had issues with over the years. Occasionally have taken my sight off of it and then found that it was something that really needed some additional support. So this is the idea that, these microbes and toxins can trigger a thickening of the blood and what's called hypercoagulation. Metals can do that, for example, as well. So you can test for these things. I've done a podcast in great detail on this topic with Dr. Ann Corson, who's another one of my heroes, and things like lumbrokinase or Baluch, nattokinase. Those are some of the tools that can be used in that realm, but it's an area that really needs to have detailed testing and monitoring to do it right. And if we're optimizing the flow of blood in the system, we're also then benefiting more from all the other things we're doing. So if you think of the blood becoming kind of this sludgy layer and oxygen delivery being impacted, it's really important to make sure that we're not hypercoagulated. In the adrenal realm, that's another area. I think sometimes we focus on it maybe a little too much, when we need to also focus on mitochondria and focus on unburdening the body from the things that are stressing the adrenals, rather than just continuing to try to pump up the adrenals. But it definitely is an area that many people benefit from some support. If the body's been fighting, we can really exhaust our adrenal reserves, and some adrenal support or adaptogenic support can be helpful. Loving Energy from BioRay is one of the products that I really love. Holy Basil, which we talked about earlier in the mast cell activation realm. There's so many boxes that Holy Basil checks off that I think that can be a great support in this adaptogen realm for adrenal support as well.
Love it. That's perfect, Scott. Thank you so much. Step 9. So here's what we've been waiting for, those pesky critters. How do we support the body with microbial overgrowth? And I know you've said it before, and I will resonate with you that it's not about kill, kill, kill. It's really about optimizing the terrain, but we might want to address some of the things that have overgrown. So what do you recommend here?
Yeah, so totally agree with you. It may seem like this is the place to start, but in my experience, that's generally not the case. We want to get all these other foundational pieces in place first. And then once we start supporting the body with the different pathogens, there could be a scenario where the order here changes as well. But as a general guideline, I like to think first about the viruses, the retroviral activation, then the parasites and gut issues, then the fungal mold and yeast organisms, and then later the Lyme and co-infections piece, and maybe some biofilm support. I think it's very common, and I know this is common in the MS realm as well, to have a reactivation of viruses like Epstein-Barr virus or HHV6 or herpes zoster, for example. Or there's a lot of conversation in recent years about endogenous retroviruses and their activation within us. We all have them. They're part of what we inherit in our DNA when we're conceived. But threats in the environment, like EMFs, for example, now cause them to activate in a way that is not health supporting. And so that's another area that we need to support long term while we're working through the rest of these microbial issues. So many tools. BioPure has some great ones like EN N-V or NV, Cystis T. Beyond Balance has some great tools. Microbe Formulas does as well. And then ingredients like sulforaphane or pantothene or selenium or lysine. There's even some homeopathics from Energetics that I like a lot too. So getting some viral support on board to really kind of support and unburden the immune system. Then moving on to things like parasites and SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and other GI dysbioses. So I think that parasites are much more common than people recognize, that they're not difficult to acquire, even if we've never left the US. Testing is notoriously difficult. So I think you have to kind of combine several tools. Energetic testing, either various systems of muscle testing or device testing can be helpful. Dr. Simon Yu uses acupuncture meridian assessment, which is also a device testing tool that has been fantastic. Dr. Raphael D'Angelo with Para Wellness Research does some great testing looking at stool and urine under the microscope. And I think he has one of the better tests out there for exploring parasites. One that I've used and definitely found helpful. Diagnostics and the GI map and things like that can be helpful. None of them are perfect, though. So sometimes we need to look from a couple of different angles. And then when we're talking about parasites, there's the larger helminths or nematodes or worms, but there's also the smaller protozoa like Giardia and Cryptosporidium and Toxoplasmosis and so on. So I tend to like the combination of something herbal with something homeopathic or energetics. Dr. David Jernigan formulated a product called Paragen many years ago. That's one of my favorites. Energetics has a product called Paracord and Amoeba Cord that are homeopathic and can be very supportive in these parasite protocols. Microbe Formulas is known for their parasite tools as well as some of their detoxification tools. And even pharmaceutical antiparasitics, I think, play a role. I don't think they're necessarily required, but some people benefit from the synergy of the pharmaceutical antiparasitic interventions like Alinea and ivermectin and Diltricide and so on with some herbal and or homeopathics. And so it's critical here to support detoxification, though. When we're killing these parasites, we're probably releasing more metals into the system. So you've got to really ramp up your focus on the detox and drainage piece. And then SIBO, another interesting topic that probably 5-6 years ago we didn't hear a lot about. It's not necessarily a pathogenic overgrowth, but it is that there's too many bacteria in the wrong location. So people often say SIBO is location, location, location. And so I tend to think of SIBO as maybe needing some herbal support or even pharmaceutical support to kind of balance those microbes, but also what's the underlying reason that this issue is in place. And a lot of times that comes back to the migrating motor complex, to the vagus nerve, and supporting those as well, so that you have that movement or peristalsis in this migrating motor complex through the digestive tract. Then there can be other dysbioses or overgrowths like Clostridia or Klebsiella, Proteus, and so on. And there's a lot. Biocidin is a great tool in that realm. Megaspore Biotic that we talked about earlier, I find very helpful for helping to optimize the microbiome. Beyond Balance has one called IMNGI that I like a lot as well. And then when we get into talking about fungi, the yeast, the molds, this could be Candida, which is a yeast, but it could also be that colonization of Aspergillus from the water damage building exposure that we're constantly breathing in. And one of the challenges, again, when we release these or reduce these fungi in the system is they can also release metals, similar to what happens with the parasites. So we need to make sure the detoxification support is not forgotten. That should be kind of there all the time in the background. And when we're looking at the fungal support, Metagenics has some products, Candibactin AR and BR that are great. Beyond Balance, Byron White formulas. There's pharmaceutical tools like itraconazole, for example. And I think the fungal piece does play a big role in our health. There are some researchers that feel that the fungi are the biggest threat to human health. And so definitely an area we don't want to overlook. And then eventually, we're at the point now that we talk about Lyme, Borrelia, and co-infections, Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, some of the opportunistic infections like Mycoplasma and Chlamydia, for example. And so these, I feel more drawn to start with herbal formulations, again, Beyond Balance, Byron White. They have some fantastic tools. I think we need to kind of unlayer them one at a time. If we start with something that is too broad spectrum, that can lead to a lot of die-off and more inflammation in the system. So being a little more methodical about supporting the Bartonella and then layering in the Babesia or the Borrelia, I think that that's a better approach. And if someone's having a strong positive or negative reaction to these more targeted formulas, then that also gives you and your practitioner more information about, oh, maybe this is a big area that we need to really have some longer term focus on. And once we then have this kind of layered approach in place, I think then we can maybe move on to broader spectrum tools, maybe a smaller number of things that are going to be broader in their coverage for Lyme and co-infections. We then can start thinking about biofilms. I think the biofilm piece comes late in the process, that you want to deal with as many of the free floating microbes as possible before you start breaking down their hiding places and releasing more microbes and more toxins into circulation and stimulating the immune system. So for me, the biofilm piece comes very late in the process. There are some practitioners that like to incorporate biofilm support early on. And then in that realm, there's a lot of, BioPure has Cystis T, which Dr. Klinghardt talks a lot about as a selective biofilm breaker. Some biofilms are healthy. Many biofilms are healthy. So we don't always want to just take something that's going to, blow all the biofilms out of the body. There are enzyme formulas like Claire Labs has Interphase Plus, Beyond Balance has BFM, lots of different enzymes. But again, I feel like this is something you need to bring in later in a protocol. And not everybody needs to even necessarily address this. Some people can feel quite well and recovered without, trying to break down the biofilms. So at this point, I would say I'm not generally drawn to starting with pharmaceutical options if someone is functional. If they're in a wheelchair, they're having seizures, they're really impaired, then there may be a role for some of the pharmaceuticals. But if people are relatively functional, I think trying to explore the natural options, put this whole framework in place, I think it oftentimes works very well. It is an exciting time, I think, in the Lyme and co-infection realm. New tools that have been emerging over the last couple of years. So disulfiram, for example, which is a pharmaceutical that's been around for about 60 or 70 years to treat alcoholism, has been found to be very, very helpful for many people dealing with Lyme disease. And so that's something that a number of practitioners are exploring. I think more and more tools are continuing to emerge. So in the natural realm, it's just great. We have so many tools as compared to 2005 when I finally got diagnosed. The choice was antibiotics, and I did antibiotics for 3.5 years. That would be one thing I would probably change now, but not because it was something I regret or was wrong. At the time, that was just the solutions that we had. So BioPure, Vital Plan, Supreme Nutrition, Beyond Balance, DesBio, MEPA Herbals, Research Nutritionals, Nutrimetics, and there's so many great companies now that have specific products to help deal with Lyme disease and co-infections.
Oh, beautiful, Scott. I also want to put a pause here to say this is a place that I don't advocate doing a DIY approach because it is so complicated. I mean, Scott is taking us through everything from viruses and fungi to mold and mycotoxins and parasites, and it can be daunting and overwhelming. I have the privilege of collaborating now with a naturopathic practitioner, Dr. Pedro, and she and I, to a client, find infections of some variety in every single person. So this is something that I want people to dig into, but I also caution going it alone. We have the tools now to get fantastic data. And this is where I invite people to, this is time to dig in, because I have never seen, I think I can say this with assurance, I've never seen an autoimmune client without an infection, at least one, and maybe multiple.
Absolutely. Dr. Klinghardt, I just did a podcast with him. We talked about autoimmunity. And so his response was that there is always an infection or a toxin that is triggering the immune system to do what it thinks is its best to protect us. So totally agree with that. And then to your point, I think I said this earlier, but my goal in putting this information out in the blogosphere, the podcasts and so on, is not to empower people to self-treat. I think they do need a practitioner. My goal is to provide information that leads to conversation between the patient and the practitioner, and maybe then leads them to exploring something in a collaboration. But absolutely agree. I have my own practitioners. I don't jump in and just start treating things myself. And I think that really is important, because you can actually make things worse if you're doing it incorrectly.
Yes, absolutely, positively. And you are a practitioner's practitioner. I mean, the people that listen to your podcast are, by and large, they're practitioners and highly educated patients, although I don't like that word. I tend to think of it as we call ourselves patients because we have to have patience. But these are people you are empowering to be so educated that they're smarter most of the time than their doctors. So they're going to be educating their doctor. They're going to take this information, go to their doctor and ask for these tests, to consider these things that they hadn't considered before. So it's a fantastic, not only starting point, but a place to just go and continuously educate yourself, because there's so much to this. And that takes us to the next step, which is the dental contributors. It is such a big category, and I know it's at step 10 for good reasons, but I had this experience myself. I didn't realize that I had cavitations until just a few years ago. And I dealt with it. I treated it. I went through this period of time where I think I had 9 colds in 1 year and had no idea why. I was catching everything. I didn't have the first clue. Somebody recommended, why not go get a cone beam x-ray? I did that. I had the surgery because they found cavitations in all 4 of my wisdom teeth area. Honestly, my immune system has been so unburdened. It's just been one of the best things, like a complete game changer for me, was having that surgery. So talk to us about oral health.
Yeah. So in terms of the placement of this, again, if somebody has an obvious issue, this may come earlier. Part of the reason that I put it here is oftentimes, and Dr. Simon Yu has been one of my big mentors as well, also have interviewed him on the podcast. If someone's dealing with parasites, he will often work to address their parasites before doing the dental work. In Dr. Klinghardt's work, if someone's dealing with, let's say, cavitations, for example, and they're also dealing with retroviruses, he will support the retroviral piece before doing the dental work to really optimize the procedure, the response, the healing, the long-term benefits. So I think in some cases, jumping into the dental work before some of the microbial issues have been addressed systemically may not be ideal. There are certainly contributors from retroviruses and Bartonella, for example, that are creating some of these dental problems. So that's kind of the rationale for why I put it here. It could move earlier in some people. It's also a little more invasive commonly. So we want to make sure that the body is supported as much as possible so that it can handle that procedure. I definitely think that amalgams, root canals, cavitations can be major stressors on our system, but it may not necessarily be the first place that we want to start. So similar to your experience, I had my cavitations done 7 years ago. I'm glad that I did it. I was already largely feeling quite good. I just happened to be at a conference with Dr. Simon Yu and said, well, I'm here. I might as well schedule an appointment. And he was the one that said you need dental surgery. And so it was a little bit of a shock at that point. In fact, I remember reading a book by Perry Fields many years ago and kind of going through her Lyme journey. And she talked about her cavitations and this black goo that came out of the sites when the surgery was done. And I remember reading it. I think I was doing a coffee enema at the moment. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I didn't have to go down that path. And lo and behold, the cavitations were an issue. So fortunately, the anxiety leading up to the procedure was much worse than the procedure itself. Yeah. I did not find it to be a significantly difficult difficult process. And so it is something that can really unburden the body. I often wonder how much cavitation set the stage for these conditions as well. My wisdom teeth had been taken out when I was a teenager. Years later, developed Lyme. And when I've talked to people like Dr. Stuart Nunley, who does a lot of work with cavitations, he says they're fairly common even in people that don't have conditions like chronic Lyme disease, for example. So it may have been something that was just kind of simmering there for many, many years. Amalgams, we certainly know, contribute to our heavy metal burden. I do not recommend people going to the dentist and having their amalgams removed without coordinating the timing of that event with their primary treating doctor and without working with a biological dentist. I've seen too many people that hear, oh, you need to get your amalgams out. They go to some dentist that they found on Yelp, and suddenly they're much, much worse because the metals have been redistributed. And so that's really critical to make sure the timing is right and that you have a biological dentist. Root canals are interesting. Fortunately, I've not had any root canals, but they can definitely impact other meridians, organs, other systems of the body. And so in general, root canals are the only scenario where dead body parts are left in the body. And so they are not health supporting. They're probably a focal infection source that's kind of then continuing to keep the body infected with a number of different organisms. You know, people like Dr. Dale Bredesen talk about how they find a number of these dental microbes in the brains of people that have died from Alzheimer's disease. So it's really critical to, focus on the dental microbiome as well. Cavitations are infections, generally speaking, in the jawbone in areas with prior tooth extractions. That's not always the case. You can have cavitations in sites that have not had extraction, but more commonly it's an extracted tooth that then gets some infection in the bone. And so with Lyme and co-infections, I think it's probably the case that there is higher risk, particularly with Bartonella. They can require surgical intervention. I have not seen ozone and things like that resolve an actual cavitation. It's similar to the whole idea of mold. You need to find the source and remove it, and then you do the ozone and the other things that may be helpful. And then the tonsils, we need to think about the tonsils too. There's so many people that are dealing with conditions like pandas and PANS, these autoimmune conditions that can be associated with strep, associated with the tonsils. So that's another piece of this whole oral health that we need to think about. And I think there are a number of tools that we can incorporate earlier to help support the oral microbiome, where we then might later have to do something more significant. But things like oral defense from Supreme Nutrition, biobotanical research that makes biocidin. They have a dental cidin toothpaste and a mouthwash that you can use as well. Some essential oils can be helpful. Oil pulling can be great. So making sure that we do have some focus on managing the oral microbiome. In fact, now there's even some probiotic products that have come out that are intended to help support the oral microbiome. So every part of the body has a different biome, the brain biome, the sinuses, the mouth, the gut. I mean, there's so many different biomes that we have. And so it's nice to see some things coming out that are a little more specific to the oral biome. And those are definitely worth exploring. So, my main thought here is that putting this towards the end is that there's other things we need to do to set the stage for a good outcome in the event we do need to do something surgically.
That's perfect. I love it. I agree with that. Now, step 11 is your final step. And this is all about regeneration and restoration, which sounds fantastic and needed. Tell us more about this step.
Yeah, so I think by the time most of us have been through Lyme disease or mold illness or an autoimmune condition, it has definitely taken a toll on our body. I think we then want to incorporate things to really help to regenerate and restore. There are a number of tools in this arena that we can introduce earlier as well, but at some point we might be done essentially with most of our core protocol. We might be feeling pretty asymptomatic. We've done a lot to reduce the microbes and the toxins and so on, but then we want to focus on this restoration and regeneration piece. So phospholipids can be phenomenal. Phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethanolamine. There's whole blends of these fat lipid components that actually make up our cell walls. And so that can be done orally. It can be done through IV therapies as well. I use a phosphatidylcholine product in my shake every morning, but that whole phospholipid arena has a lot of potential. Peptides are emerging as a tool that can really help to repair and restore and regenerate the body. I think that things like BPC 157, for example, there's so many of them coming out. I hope that we'll have access to them long term. There's some question about whether or not they're going to be available for long, but I do think that the peptide arena is really exciting as well. And then photobiomodulation, so using red light therapy to support the mitochondria to rebuild the collagen, which is impacted by Borrelia. So a lot of times there's impacts to our collagen when we're going through these types of conditions, and just giving the body more photons, more vital force. I use a product called the Rejuvenator, which is a really nice tool for local issues, like if you have a shoulder issue or knee issue, and then also the Juve for systemic type exposure to red light therapy. And so I think that there's a lot of tools emerging in this realm. I think many of them can be very good. There may be at some point a more clear place for stem cells and exosomes and all of those. For the most part in the Lyme arena, I've been disappointed with stem cells. I think if people are going to benefit from them, that this is the place where it makes the most sense, very much towards the end. I think many people over the years have kind of jumped to, well, I'm still really sick and I still have Lyme and still live in my moldy house, but I'm going to go do stem cells and hope that that gets me out of this situation. And for the most part, I think that's not proven to be very helpful. But in the regeneration, restoration realm, I'm looking forward to seeing more evolution here. And then prior to COVID, I had found a tool called Vasper, which is a cold compression therapy. You have what looks like blood pressure cuffs on your arms and legs. So they're compressing the muscles, and also they're running water through those cuffs that are about 45 degrees. It's quite cold. But that's a 21-minute process that you go through that's relatively easy. And it's also kind of, with the compression and the cold, it's tricking the brain into thinking that there's an injury, and it then needs to release repair and growth factors and so on. And I loved it. And I did it for over a year. In fact, that therapy single-handedly got me off of thyroid medication that I had been on for probably 2 decades. And I'm very much missing it. So my focus right now has been on, things that I can do more at home, but I'm really looking forward to getting back to Vasper, because I think it is a huge tool in this regeneration and restoration realm that can really be amazingly helpful for us.
That's wonderful. That's a fantastic story. And I hope that some of these regeneration, restoration tools can be more accessible to people, because I find sometimes the cost of these peptides, for example, is it's prohibitive for many people to be able to access this, and plus stem cells. And, I would add something to this, which is just fasting, intermittent fasting, and fasting longer. We can promote autophagy in our body, the clearing out of old cells and dead cells, and rejuvenate and create our own stem cells without having to go to some of these centers for that super expensive stem cell treatment. So I'm excited to learn more about that.
Yeah, no, I love that you brought that up. So that's an area that I'm also very interested in. There's senolytics, various supplements that are becoming available that can kind of help support that autophagy mechanism. There's also, you mentioned fasting, so intermittent fasting potentially could be helpful. But there's also tools like Prolon that was created. It's a 5-day fasting mimicking diet that was created by Walter Longo. And so there are tools in that realm. Autophagy is still something that most people probably haven't heard about. But I think that we're seeing more and more of these kinds of products and things to support that cellular cleansing mechanism. And I totally agree with you. That's a really important piece.
I'll just add a footnote on the Prolon piece, because while I totally agree that a 5-day fasting mimicking diet is fantastic, I wasn't a fan of his packaged product because it includes things like nightshades and grains. which are not necessarily good for people with autoimmune issues. I think that you can do your own fasting mimicking diet, and I invite people to, do your own research to find something that works for you. But intermittent fasting can be as simple as starting with just go for 12 hours without eating, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And there's your first intermittent fast. And then as you can tolerate, adding another hour to go to maybe 13 hours. And if that feels good, go to 14 hours. And this is something that I has been transformational for me. And I think many people with autoimmune issues can really benefit from intermittent fasting. I'm taking us off track, but I'm always a fan of finding things that people can do, that we can access right now that are lower cost interventions, perhaps. So we'll have to dig into that another
Beautiful.
time. So you have given us so much to think about, Scott. This has just been a wealth of information, but not just information. This is information that you've personally explored, experimented with, researched, learned about, tweaked, continuously learn about, and now you're sharing with the world to make our journeys that much simpler. And that is heroic. I mean, what you're doing is actually shortcutting our time back to health. And that is a gift that you're giving the world. And I'm just so grateful to you for that. But I wonder if you have any final words before we end here.
Yeah. So first, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to share this information with your audience. I'm very, very grateful. You and I are definitely kindred spirits, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing as well. I've also had the great honor to be on the board of directors of the Limelight Foundation, where we provide treatment grants to children and young adults 25 and under. By the end of this year, we'll have given out over $6 million to support direct treatment grants for people dealing with Lyme-related conditions. So if someone's listening and is in need of that type of support or in a position to help to support our work, we would love to hear from you. And the website for that is limelightfoundation.org. And then similar to the way that we wrapped up part one, I think the most important message is don't ever lose hope. Don't ever give up. There is so much that's changing in our understanding of these conditions, in the solutions that are emerging. I'm seeing more happening now in the past few years than I've seen in maybe the prior 20. So new tools, new solutions that are really supportive of moving us in a good direction. There is hope. People do get better. So if you're still struggling through one of these conditions, just hang in there, and don't ever forget that there is a lot of hope out there.
Oh, beautifully, beautifully said, Scott. So I invite people to go to your website, betterhealthguy.com, listen to and subscribe to Scott's blogcast. You will not be disappointed. There is every kind of information in there that supports recovering from chronic illness. And I'm just so grateful to you, Scott. Thank you so much for your time, your generosity, and for being with us. I'm just so thankful.
Thank you so much, Palmer. I'm very lucky to have been here and honored that you invited me.
All right. Take care, my friend. Look forward to the next time.
All right. Thanks.
And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share it with your friends and family, and if you feel inspired, please leave a quick review so other people can find it too. Now, if you want to beat autoimmune and thrive, make sure you sign up for my free video training at freeautoimmunetraining.com. That's freeautoimmunetraining.com, and watch the first video right away. Take good care. Bye for now.